The B-17 bomber was a massive four-engine heavy bomber used by the Allies in World War II, designed for high-altitude strategic bombing.
Today we're telling you the impossible story of First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson, the only pilot in recorded history to fly a bomber without a cockpit. This is a tale of survival that defied every law of physics, every military protocol, and every definition of human endurance. But before we dive into this extraordinary story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because stories like this don't come around often. July 14th, 1944. The Allied forces were closing in on Nazi Germany, but the war was far from over. Deep in enemy territory lay one of the most crucial targets of the entire conflict: the Ferencvároda Radio railroad yards in Budapest, Hungary. This wasn't just any railroad, this was the lifeline of the German war machine, critical for moving troops, equipment, and most importantly, oil. Destroy this, and you could cripple Nazi operations across Eastern Europe. The mission called for 60 B-17 flying fortresses from the 483rd Bomb Group. Leading one of these massive bombers was 24-year-old First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson, piloting a battle-tested fortress nicknamed MSPA, tail number 4-23210. Swanson was young, but he wasn't green. He'd flown multiple combat missions over Europe, each one a roll of the dice with death. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what was about to happen at 25,000 feet above Hungary. As the formation crossed into Hungarian airspace, the sky erupted into a nightmare of black smoke and shrapnel. This was Flak, anti-aircraft artillery, and the Germans had positioned over 200 of their deadly 88mm guns directly in the bomber's path. Imagine being trapped in a flying metal box while explosions detonate all around you. The sound alone was enough to drive men insane, but Swanson and his crew pressed forward, their massive bomber shuddering with each near miss. MSPA took hit after hit. Shrapnel tore through her wings, punched holes in her tail section, but she kept flying. The target was dead ahead, those crucial railroad yards that could change the course of the war. In the nose of the aircraft, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dodley, the bombardier, lined up his Sperry bomb sight. Seconds ticked by like hours. Then, with practiced precision, he released their deadly cargo. Mission accomplished. Or so they thought. Because what happened next would be seared into the memory of every man who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. A German 88mm shell traveling at over 2,700 feet per second found its mark. The nose of MSPA simply disappeared. Not damaged, not cracked, completely vaporized. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dodley, the bombardier who had just completed their mission, was killed instantly. The navigator beside him suffered the same fate. In a split second, two young men were erased from existence. But here's where this story becomes almost supernatural. The explosion didn't just kill two crew members, it completely destroyed the cockpit. The control column that Swanson used to fly the aircraft was gone. The instruments, the windscreen, the protection from the -30-degree air screaming through at 200 miles per hour. All of it gone. The laws of physics said this aircraft should have immediately entered an uncontrollable death spiral. The center of gravity had shifted so dramatically that MSPA pitched up into an almost vertical climb, seconds away from stalling out completely. But somehow, impossibly, First Lieutenant Ewald Swanson regained control. What happened next defies everything we know about aviation. Without a cockpit, without controls, Swanson and his crew did something that had never been attempted in the history of flight. They flew the bomber by hand. Picture this. Inside a freezing, blood-soaked aircraft, crew members grabbed the exposed control cables, the very wires that connected to the aircraft's control surfaces, and began manually operating them based on Swanson's shouted commands from what remained of the pilot's position. It was like performing surgery while riding a hurricane. One wrong pull on those cables and all 8 remaining crew members would plummet to their deaths. The crew of a nearby B-17, nicknamed Yvonne, couldn't believe what they were seeing. A blood-soaked bomber with no nose pulled up alongside them in formation, flying as if nothing had happened. It was one of the most haunting sights of the war, but the nightmare wasn't over. Those 200 German guns were still firing, and MSPA was now a sitting duck. Another direct hit. This time, MSPA's number 2 engine erupted in flames and died. Now imagine the impossible situation. A bomber with no nose, 1 engine destroyed, flying at 25,000 feet, in enemy territory, being operated by men pulling control cables by hand. The drag from all the damage was increasing every second. MSPA began falling behind the formation, becoming isolated and vulnerable. For 10 agonizing minutes, Swanson and his crew battled to keep their dying fortress airborne. Every second they stayed in the air was borrowed time. The Hungarian countryside stretched endlessly below them, enemy territory as far as the eye could see. Finally, Swanson made the hardest decision a pilot can make. Over the howling wind and chaos, he shouted the words no one wanted to hear. "Bail out! Bail out now!" One by one, 7 crew members jumped from their dying aircraft, but someone had to stay behind to keep MSPA steady during the evacuation. That someone was Ewald Swanson. Alone in the wreckage of his bomber, Swanson held the aircraft as steady as humanly possible while his crew bailed out to safety. Only when the last man had jumped did he grab his own parachute. But as MSPA finally gave up the fight and pitched into her final climb, Swanson found himself trapped. The centrifugal forces pinned him inside the fuselage as the bomber began to stall. As the aircraft reached its stall point and hung motionless in the sky, Swanson saw his chance. He jumped, but his parachute caught on the torn metal of what used to be his cockpit, ripping through the fabric with brutal force. In a twisted way, this damage may have saved his life. If the chute hadn't torn, he would have been dragged down with the bomber. Swanson was violently thrown clear of MSPA, narrowly missing her tail section. The young pilot lost consciousness as he fell from 20,000 feet. When he opened his eyes, the ground was rushing up to meet him. He had seconds to live. With his damaged parachute barely slowing his descent, Swanson faced certain death. But as he plummeted toward the earth, he spotted something that would save his life: a German POW camp in the middle of a dense forest. Using his last moments of consciousness, he steered toward the treetops above the camp. The dense canopy broke his fall, but at a terrible cost. He suffered a broken left leg and deep cuts from the branches. The German medics at the POW camp quickly found Swanson's broken body and administered life-saving first aid. In one of war's strangest ironies, the enemy had become his saviors. But here's the most incredible part of this already impossible story. When Swanson arrived at the POW camp, he discovered that his entire crew had survived their jumps and been captured nearby. Through sheer coincidence, all 8 men ended up at the same camp. They had cheated death together, and now they would endure captivity together. For 9 long months, through the harsh winter of 1944 to 1945, the crew of MSPA endured as prisoners of war. But on April 30th, 1945, American forces liberated the camp. The war for these 8 survivors had finally ended. Ewald Swanson's incredible act of heroism that day earned him promotion to lieutenant colonel before his retirement from the United States Air Force. But the real reward wasn't military recognition. After the war, Swanson returned to Michigan, married his beloved Catherine, and raised a son. Yet throughout his life, the bond he shared with his B-17 crew remained unbreakable. In the decades that followed, they would reunite regularly, old warriors with weathered hands and bright eyes, sharing stories of impossible missions and the brotherhood they forged when they were barely more than kids. Ewald Swanson passed away peacefully on February 28, 2009, at the age of 89. He was remembered not only as a war hero, but as the only pilot in recorded history to fly an aircraft without a cockpit. When news of Swanson's incredible feat spread through military circles, it became the stuff of legend. Aviation experts called it impossible. Military historians documented it as one of the most extraordinary acts of airmanship in history. Fellow pilots who heard the story couldn't believe it. The idea of flying a four-engine bomber without instruments, without a cockpit, using only manual control cables, defied everything they knew about aviation. Modern aeronautical engineers have studied the incident and confirmed that what Swanson and his crew accomplished should have been physically impossible. The fact that they kept MSPA airborne for over 10 minutes in that condition represents a perfect storm of skill, courage, and sheer determination. Today, aviation museums around the world tell Swanson's story as an example of the extraordinary things ordinary people can accomplish when faced with impossible circumstances. His tale has inspired countless pilots and continues to be studied in military academies as an example of leadership under extreme pressure. The story of Ewald Swanson and the crew of MSPA reminds us that human courage knows no limits. When everything seemed lost, when death appeared certain, these 8 young men refused to give up. They flew the impossible, they survived the unsurvivable, and they came home. Only MSPA and the men who dared to ride her into battle could ever truly understand what that meant. What did you think of Swanson's incredible story? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of human courage and survival. Until next time, keep exploring the extraordinary.